Tim, for joining us today. Greatly appreciated, and I will let you go ahead.
Perfect, thank you. So I will turn my video off as well, just at the moment here. I decided everyone could see me at least this way before and say hello and good morning. So as I was introduced by Pam, I am OMAFR's Drainage Program Coordinator. And we do a lot of different things across the province as far as drainage goes. So we'll touch on a fair bit of that today, focusing in on sort of the topic there, agricultural field drainage, and then how municipal right-of-ways and roadside ditches, et cetera. But I'm open to have a conversation about drainage in general. Okay, so I have a fairly extensive agenda here. And again, we'll just sort of walk through. So I want to talk a little bit about drainage and why it's important for our agricultural community, but even beyond that, it's important for roads, et cetera. Talk a little bit about some of the factors that affect the choices around drainage, right? So why does somebody put in drainage? How do we size it appropriately and what kind of contributes to those areas? Talk a little bit about common law and drainage in terms of a background with some example case law. It's really important to understand the foundation of drainage and the law, and then how legislation may modify that. And then I want to get into this idea, what are private drainage systems? I'm not sure of the background, everyone on the call here, just to make sure we're all in the same place as far as how these systems function, how they outlet and where they outlet, and then get into specifically the outlet situation. So roadside ditches, mutual agreement drains, and petition drains as all being sort of three potential options for the outletting of these systems and management of the water off of property. And then walk through a specific example and then get into some resources. And again, time at the end for questions. But again, obviously, if people would like, I'm happy to do that throughout the presentation. So here we go. Okay, so drainage is essential. And drainage is really a combination of a variety of types of systems. It's a whole network, if you will, of water management. And so it's a combination of private drainage systems. It could be agricultural tile drainage, as shown in the top right corner there of a recently tiled field. And they're also communal systems. And those communal systems eventually outlet into natural water courses, and the ultimate receiving body here in this particular area being Lake Ontario eventually. But there are other natural water courses across the landscape as well. So these private drainage systems are not just agricultural, though. They're a wide variety of systems. So they're agriculturally put in place to improve crop productivity, increasing yields. But they're also in place to actually do good soil management through allowing infiltration into the soil, to allow some of those larger storm events to potentially soak in and have less runoff. So they do play an environmental role as well as crop productivity. But it's also important to note that these private systems include road drainage systems, so systems that are put in place to provide drainage for roads and keep our roads properly drained and safe. And all of these systems really require what I'm going to use as the term legal and sufficient outlets. So there's two terms there that we're going to touch on throughout this presentation. And those outlets can be natural water courses. They could be drains under the Drainage Act. They could be roadside ditches, mutual agreement drains, handshake deals, whatever they are. There's a wide variety of that outlet being available across the landscape. And the two terms, again, are legal. So do I have the right to dump my water or to put my water there? And then sufficiency of outlet. Does that outlet have the proper capacity and proper systems in place to handle the flow of water and not cause damage or other issues downstream of my property where I'm discharging to? So for a little bit of context on the agricultural side, private agricultural drainage systems account for 1.9 million hectares of the about 3.6 million hectares of cropland in Ontario. So about 60% of all cropland in Ontario is currently tile drained. You'll see a lot of activity in different areas of the province that is sometimes new installations, right? So a lot of times farmers will be looking at improving the productivity on their cropland. And as Pam mentioned, that's partially due to the expensiveness of land in general across the province of late. And so a lot of times it's more economical to invest in improvements on crop productivity with the tile drainage system than it is to purchase additional acres. And then for a little bit of context, I know that this area does not have a lot of drains under the Drainage Act, but for some provincial context, there are approximately 50,000 kilometers of drains constructed under the Drainage Act across the province. And those are focused a lot in the southwest, sort of west of Toronto up towards Owen Sound as well, but there are other pockets up in the north, over in the east area, Ottawa towards the Quebec border, et cetera, where they're extensively used to provide outlet for roads for these agricultural operations, et cetera. So factors affecting drainage. So it's really important. Drainage, as you hopefully can appreciate, is very a complex issue, and it can be a very contentious issue as well across rural Ontario. It deals, of course, with private property rights, and it often involves conflicts between neighboring properties, especially when it's not done well. Neighbors can flood neighbors out by providing drainage across individual properties where they don't have that legal right, or even if they have been given permission, the sufficiency of that outlet isn't appropriate to allow the water to not damage downstream property. So it's quite complex. And really, it's about balancing a property owner's needs for drainage with the environmental and societal interests. We think of climate change, we think of erosion control, nutrient transport, those sorts of things, as well as regulatory compliance, because there is a role in which CA, conservation authorities play, Department of Fisheries and Oceans get involved in some cases as well. And so this is a complex need of balancing those needs as well as the drainage needs. And then once these systems are built and in place, there's an ongoing need for maintenance of that infrastructure, right? So once it's built, it works hopefully perfectly as designed day one, but with time, that drainage ditch or that pipe can fill up with sediment. It can be cracked, broken. Vegetation may need to be cleaned out a little bit to increase or improve that capacity. And those things are needs that need to go on the landscape, both from a maintenance perspective, for a dollar perspective, as well as a workload perspective as well. Some of the other things that come into play when we're looking at drainage is, what is the size of the watershed? What's the topography? What's the soil type? Are the soils prone to a high runoff rate in these large storm events that come up in certain times of year, or due to these climate and variability issues that we come up across with large thunderstorms in the summer? Is there water coming from other upstream properties? If we're looking at, providing outlet for a property, is it strictly that one property that's outletting, or is there surface water flowing onto that property from upstream? Or are there other connections into that tile drainage system that may affect the sufficiency of that outlet? And then as well, we need to talk a little bit about system design constraints for some of these outlets and the property owner's needs. Where is that outlet available? Is there one on their property, or do they need permission to go across other properties? Do they need to access through the road? What is the depth of that outlet? Is it sufficiently deep enough to allow that tile drainage system, for example, to be outletted into it? And then, as we mentioned, the changing weather patterns, variability, and the increased land prices with the idea of increasing productivity on my existing land are all the complicated factors that come into an individual decision around a drainage system installation and design. So a lot goes into these things. And hopefully, if they're done well, the pre-planning is done to consider all of these as best as possible prior to starting work. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as far as our contractors and the farmers and things like that in the area. So to get a little bit into the background here of the common law and drainage, first, my name is not a lawyer, so I'm an engineer by training, and so this is information that is legal in nature, but I'm not providing legal advice. I just need to say that in general, but this is some commonly available information. This information is, generally speaking, posted on OMAFRA's website. I'll provide that link at the end of the presentation for people to go and look at and see. So this is readily available information on our website, but again, it's not legal advice per se. So what is the common law? And the common law is really, if you will, on the bottom right, that little schematic, it's the bedrock where it's rules, principles, and customs established in England for the most part, and it applies across Canada with the exception of Quebec. So Quebec has a different system of common law. I don't recall the exact term, but it was developed through the French system. But everywhere else, Ontario included, it's the common law established in England. That's been adopted here. So almost all law on watercourses is founded on this idea of water flows naturally. Of course, we can't stop water from flowing downhill easily. We can do that, of course, and we can even pump it uphill. But water that flows naturally downhill should be permitted to flow. And so that's the idea of this common law piece. But it does distinguish between a natural watercourse and surface water. And so we're going to get into what are the differences on the next couple of slides. But basically, natural watercourses are things where there are riparian rights established by common law. So there's rights and obligations, and we'll talk about those. And then the difference between natural watercourses, the other thing, if it's not a natural watercourse under common law, it's surface water. And despite the fact that it flows downhill, there is no natural right of drainage for surface water. So if you think of rain that falls on a farmer's field and there's some highly impermeable clay soils and that develops runoff, that water inherently doesn't have a natural right, or a legal right rather, of drainage, even though of course it inherently flows downhill by gravity. So there's a little bit of a tension between that. We're going to explore that a little bit. So common law always exists unless it's modified by statute law. So examples are the Drainage Act will modify the right of drainage. So the Drainage Act can be used to allow that surface water to buy a right of drainage that normally doesn't exist under the common law. And there are some other examples, such as the Ontario Water Resources Act. So if you are a riparian owner, you have the right to utilize that water, and you have the right to discharge your drainage water into that natural water course, unless modified by that act, the Ontario Water Resources Act. And in some cases, you can take water from that natural water course, but it's limited now to a certain amount without a permit. So 50,000 liters per day is allowed to be taken for purposes. And if you go beyond that now, the Ontario Water Resources Act says your common law rights are modified, you have to get a permit. The Conservation Authorities Act is another example of that. Interesting to note, under the common law, no agency is assigned responsibility to resolve drainage issues. So if there's a legislative framework, Conservation Authorities Act, they may have certain rights and ability to regulate activities, which they do. But if that framework under that act doesn't give them the authority to manage things, then it falls under common law, and there isn't actually assigned responsibility for that drainage issue. It is resolved by mutual agreement then, or by the court system when it falls under common law. So again, the Drainage Act was passed to provide a mechanism for private property owners to solve their drainage issues where they can't resolve them mutually with their neighbor, and without having to go to court, it provides an alternative pathway. So I am going to touch on that a little bit. I'm going to stay away from the Drainage Act a lot until the very end, just to give a little bit of it, because it is a mechanism that could be used. And even though it hasn't been used a lot historically in this area, property owners do have the legal right to petition their municipality for a drain under the Drainage Act. So I did want to leave you with that as a mechanism for getting outlet as well. It won't be the focus of our presentation, however. So some common questions that I hear every day, well, mostly every day in terms of phone calls, and we're going to try to answer some of these throughout this presentation. So who is responsible to remove a beaver dam from a creek is a very common example of a question. Can my neighbor stop my water if it's been flowing that way forever? In other words, has my neighbor, now somebody doesn't like my water coming across their property? If my neighbor refuses to share in the cost of a drain across his property, can I just outlet my water at the edge of the property, at the fence line, etc.? Can my neighbor stop surface water from flowing onto their land? Can I drain part of my property to a different outlet? In other words, a different watershed or a sub-watershed? Can the road stop me from putting my water into the roadside ditch? It goes that way naturally anyways. What can I do to make my neighbor clean out the ditch or creek on their property? What can I do to make the municipality clean out or deepen the roadside ditch? That kind of relates to the question above as well, but a different property owner, private versus municipal. And then my favorite question is what my neighbor doing a violation of the Drainage Act? So I'm going to answer that one first in terms of the Drainage Act piece. We're going to get into more detail. The Drainage Act, as you'll see, is really about a framework and a process to potentially allow property owners to get a communal outlet for their property or properties. And really the Drainage Act, if someone's doing something on the landscape, it typically would fall under the common law in your geography because there's not many municipal drains there. So when I get the question of, is it a violation of the Drainage Act? The answer would typically be no in your area. It falls under common law, unless, of course, we're dealing with a municipal drain under the Drainage Act. So let's look a little bit into some of these broader questions and some examples. So again, coming back to this idea of the common law differentiating between natural water courses and surface water. So a natural water course is in the little blue box there, a stream of water which flows along a defined channel with beds and banks for a sufficient time to give substantial existence and may include streams that dry up periodically. So you can tell hopefully that was a lawyer that wrote that, and it's from the common law. It is very, very broad, right? So there are lots of different scenarios across the landscape where I look at something, particularly that piece where it says may include streams that dry up periodically. So we're talking even about ephemeral type of streams can be applied as a natural water course. And so this legal definition is the framework is what is a natural watercourse. And so a couple things to note here. The Conservation Authorities Act has a definition for a watercourse, and it's different than this one. And the reason it's different is because they have their own regulatory regime that modifies common law, and it applies on that definition. Is this a watercourse? And if it's so, then they can regulate it and apply the act and the regulations to that activity or to that development, and et cetera. But in the case of common law, it's much broader. And so it becomes really an issue before the courts in terms of, is this a natural watercourse or is it surface water? And so there are some very clear examples where Lake Ontario is a natural watercourse. The Gananaska River in most cases is going to be a natural watercourse. Up in the headlands, it becomes a bit more problematic in terms of some of the smaller ephemeral streams that may be joining into the Gananaska River, for example. Are those natural watercourses or not? And it really is a legal type of question. But if it is a natural watercourse and I am a riparian owner, which means I own land that abuts that natural watercourse, I have under the common law the right of drainage. I can provide my water into that watercourse. And that can be done all the time. It's a natural right of drainage to that. So that really speaks to the agricultural systems that are put in place. Those can be drained into that natural watercourse for landowners that abut that natural watercourse. They also have the right to use the water for domestic or natural purposes in terms of, as I said, it could be modified by the permit to take water process, for example. And then some of the other things is there's responsibility. So on a natural watercourse, you have to accept the water even if flooding occurs. So that's a really important piece in general to understand, is that flooding on natural watercourses is natural, and the courts under common law recognize that flooding is a part of living as a riparian owner on that. Not very fun to experience flooding, of course, but that's under the law, the way it's covered. Under common law, an owner is allowed to modify the channel within their own property limits, but cannot negatively impact upstream or downstream property owners. So if they make it so more water flows quickly and floods downstream, they can be liable. If they dam up something and the downstream people were relying on that for a water use, they can be liable for that. Now, the caveat to that, of course, is those individuals who may wish to modify a natural watercourse have to adhere to all other regulatory requirements. And this is where the Conservation Authority Act comes into play, where the common law is modified. In other words, landowners cannot just go in and modify a natural watercourse legally without getting the appropriate regulatory permits in place from the Conservation Authority, from Fisheries, DFO, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, which is now Fisheries and Oceans Canada, et cetera. And if they do modify or interfere or dam that natural watercourse, aside from the issues they may have by not getting the right regulatory permits, they can also be held liable for any impacts. And so here's an example on the right-hand side where we have a natural watercourse through two individual properties with that natural watercourse flowing from top to bottom. And if that lower property owner were to block the natural watercourse water for whatever reason, and it flooded up the higher agricultural property, that individual on the lower property could be held liable for the damages of the flooding, the crop issues that may result from that damming of the natural watercourse. So again, that's under the common law. So if we have water that's not now in a natural watercourse, and so water that runs in no defined channel per that very vague definition, in other words, it's not a watercourse as defined by that, then it's surface water. And surface water has no inherent right of drainage, even though it may flow naturally downhill, of course. And so flow of surface water in and of itself, as shown in the bottom left picture, is not necessarily grounds for a lawsuit or liability. So in the bottom left picture, you'll see naturally sloping land that may go from the top higher agricultural property owner across the property owner who is adjacent to a municipal drain, or that could be a natural watercourse, et cetera. And so the reality is that uncollected surface water from the higher property owner doesn't have a right of drainage under the common law, but the fact that it's not collected likely means that there's not a grounds for a lawsuit. There's no liability there because it naturally flows that way, and I'm not modified my property and collecting it through a drainage system, et cetera, and discharging it on my lower property owner. However, because there is no inherent right of drainage, the lower owner doesn't have to accept the water. And so they can actually protect their property by berms and dikes if they wanted to stop the water flow from that higher agricultural property onto their own, okay? And so that is then where we get into this little bit of a tension between the conflicting between neighbors, right? So one neighbor may not be happy with the water flowing across, and so he takes actions under the law to protect their property, which then has negative impacts on the upper agricultural property owner and may create some ponding or flooding, which has crop issues. And that's where, again, we can get into some struggles. Another sort of example here, if you look in the top right corner, we can envision this two different ways. So if the water were flowing from the right, the cornfield there on the right, and was draining to the left, the water collected, if it's surface water on that cornfield, doesn't have the inherent right of drainage, and therefore the road doesn't have to accept the water because there's two private property owners. The road doesn't have to accept the water. And so we're going to talk more and more about that as far as outlets and roadside ditches coming up. But I just want to make you aware that it doesn't matter whether it's a road or a farm property adjacent to a farm property. They're all private property, and the common law applies to all equally. The same thing to think about, though, when I said that flow of surface water is not necessarily grounds for a lawsuit unless it's collected. If the water were flowing the opposite direction from the left side of the picture across the road through, there's a small culvert there you can actually see, and discharging and causing crop damage on the far right cornfield. So we've reversed the flow of water here. There may be some liability both on the upstream agricultural or forested owner on the other side of the road, as well as the municipality and the road who've accepted that water, who've collected it in their culvert and have directed it downstream, causing damage. So it's important to kind of understand this idea of collection of surface water and acceptance of it does potentially create an issue of liability. So again, continuing that, so if collected and discharged, there could be grounds for a lawsuit under the common law. So it must not be collected and diverted to land that would not naturally receive it. So the idea behind that, we'll look at another example, is bringing in water through collection from outside of the sub-watershed could be liable for damages, even on a natural water course as well. If I've brought in more water than that natural water course would normally receive because it's been tile drained from outside the watershed to inside the watershed, there is potential for some liability there. And the Drainage Act, again, I'll just put a little piece here in for that, does allow for that to happen. But of course, then you have to design the system to account for all of that water, which is part of why the Drainage Act can be used to manage on a watershed scale. And the courts can order damages and have ordered damages paid when individuals have collected water and discharged them onto downstream property owners. So a little bit more background here as well. I want to talk a little bit about this idea of prescriptive rights of drainage. So this is very similar to sort of squatters' rights, if you will, for real property. It's a concept that is under the Real Property Statutes Limitations Act. And it basically says that if surface water, as we said, that does not have a right of drainage, has been collected and deposited or discharged onto a lower land, and it's been uncontested, unchallenged, and unchanged. I should actually have that in my slide. I apologize. That's not in there, and it should be. For a period of 20 years or more, then that right of drainage may be a prescribed right. So in other words, if it's been a squatter's right for 20 years, uncontested, unchanged, it may have a prescriptive right, and the lower landowner now does not have the ability to block that flow any longer. The interesting part of this prescriptive right is that only a judge can grant it. So in some cases, we have property owners where someone buys a lower farm and the water has been flowing, or there's a ditch going across the lower newly purchased property. And the new owner says, I don't like this anymore, and he fills in the ditch. The upper landowner could go to the courts and basically petition the court to say, I have a prescriptive right, and by providing evidence and documentation that it's been here for 20 plus years, not changed, the judge then could grant a prescriptive right, and then they've acquired the right for that drainage to go across the downstream owner's property in perpetuity as well, similar to what the Drainage Act allows. And then it's just important, this prescriptive right is only maintained when you don't increase or change the drainage flow. So if I've now added my neighbor's property into my tile drainage system that flows across this prescriptive right, I have potentially lost that prescriptive right. So it's very specific in terms of what I'm doing across my neighbor's property. But it is an issue that is applied across rural Ontario as well. That's true in many cases where if a farmer were to complain about a road culvert and they don't like the damage that's being caused, again, it may be applied here where the road authority, the municipality or whomever owns the road, could go to the courts and get a prescriptive right granted as well for that culvert if it's been unchanged, uncontested for a 20-year window. Okay, so let's take a little bit about case law then that actually supports some of this. I have 3 specific examples. So these are 3 sort of big cases, if you will, that are done across Canada. In the resource slide at the end of my presentation, I will provide you with a link to CanLII, which is the Canadian Legal Information Institute. And they have a wide variety of these legal cases that you can search for on drainage, prescriptive rights, as well as the provincial drainage referee has their decisions posted there, as well as the Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs Appeals Tribunal, which also deals with some drainage issues. So I'll provide that at the end. So let's look at a few examples of some key cases. So this one here is Linz versus Runge. It was done in BC. And if you remember, I said that common law, except for Quebec, is applicable across Canada. So this case actually sets precedents here in Ontario as well. So this is sort of shown in the picture on the bottom left. We have 2 agricultural property owners, a higher one on the top, a lower agricultural property owner on the bottom, and a natural water course running through the property. And so the higher owner is growing potatoes and hay, and the bottom owner is more of a naturalized environment. They have lots of trees and want to use their property for a different purpose than agriculture. And beavers regularly built dams at a couple locations on Runge's property, the downstream owner. And over a 5-year period, the upper landowner went on to and trespassed across the lower property owner's property and removed the beaver dams without permission. The lower agricultural property owner was an absent individual. They lived in town and they would come out and enjoy their property periodically. So they didn't have any idea that this was going on. But essentially, it provided drainage because the beaver dam was being removed by the upper property owner. The relationship deteriorated, and essentially the lower landowner said, stay off my land, and the beaver activity wasn't controlled, and flooding of the agricultural land occurred upstream. And the upstream landowner sued the downstream landowner through common law in the court system for damages to their hay and potato crop. And now if I was in a classroom setting, I would probably ask people for their thoughts on what would be the outcome of this. And so maybe I'm not going to ask for that here, but maybe just take a quick little pause for a few seconds before I sort of give the actual court's decision and think about what we talked about and what do you think in your own mind would be the resolution to this court case. Let's have a look at what the court decision was. So the court decision was that beaver dams were a natural occurrence on the watercourse, and that there is, quote unquote, no present obligation upon a landowner in Canada to alter a watercourse from its present or long-standing state in order that an adjacent landowner may make use of lands that are subject to the historical seasonal flooding. So this decision is really where we talked about there is an obligation to accept water, and there is also an obligation to accept flooding on a natural watercourse. So because this is a natural watercourse and beaver dams occur on natural watercourses, there is no obligation for an individual to remove a beaver dam or any naturally occurring obstruction in that natural watercourse, even though it may affect upstream property owners. Okay, so again, it comes back to the idea there is no central agency who's obligated to do this. There's no central individual who has an obligation to maintain the works. My predecessor in my position had a great picture, and I wish I could find it. I would have put it here. So beaver dams are one example of this. There was a major storm that happened up in sort of the somewhere between Owen Sound and Goderich, kind of on the Lake Huron area of the province a few years ago. And there's a fair bit of erosion that washed a lot of trees into the natural watercourse. The trees moved downstream with the high flows, and they actually backed up at a road, large box culvert that crossed under a road. And they actually created a fairly large dam and obstruction. And it took quite a while for people to actually understand and realize that there was no obligation on anyone to actually remove those logs. So it was in everyone's best interest that they be removed because water wasn't flowing appropriately. There may have been some damage to the road, but there wasn't an obligation by anyone or an agency to actually remove them. And it took quite a while to figure out how that was going to be resolved, and it eventually was. But so again, it's really important to understand that on a natural water course, there is no central agency to resolve these issues, and flooding is expected, and you have to expect it on a natural water course. So what would be the solution in this case potentially for the upper landowner to get the drainage he needs? One would be go back to talk to your neighbor and hopefully the relationship could be rebuilt. But aside from that, they could petition for a drain under the Drainage Act. And again, the drain under the Drainage Act, when it follows that process, would be used to modify those common law principles to allow the managed system to ensure that beaver dams aren't built there where they're not going unchecked and causing flooding upstream. So that's sort of the potential solution in this example. Okay, and the second case here. This is on prescriptive rights principle. So here we have a few properties, property A, B, and C. Property owner A has a ditch that goes across property B and C downstream into a municipal drain or a natural water course. Again, it doesn't matter what that ultimate outlet is. And the ditch was shared by the two property owners. In this picture, it's three, but the idea is all the property owners are sharing the ownership of that. The higher owner called for a contractor to maintain a section of the ditch, and the contractor mistakenly worked on the wrong ditch or the wrong property. So if you envision here, there was an issue perhaps on property C. Property owner A said, I want the contractor to come and clean this out because it's our ditch, we've shared it, and I'm having some issues. And the contractor dug across property owner B in their property. And so they were quite concerned about that. And so ultimately what happened in this case is the lower property owner blocked the ditch. And then as you can envision, the property owner A had some flooding damages because the water could not get away appropriately to the outlet, flooded their property and had some damages. So the upper property owner A sued the downstream owner who blocked the ditch. So what happened in this particular case was they went to the courts and property owner A established that that drainage ditch has been going on across those properties for a period of 23 years, I believe was specifically in this case, uncontested and unchanged. In other words, property owner A did not increase the amount of water flowing across property B and C. They did not add land into production. They did not accept water from another property. And the courts upheld that the prescriptive rights were there and they were entitled. And the court ordered that property owner B remove the blockage and the water continued to flow across the properties to its ultimate outlet. Okay, so that again is the principle of prescriptive right where it's unchanged, uncontested for 20 years. Property owners, even if they purchased the property themselves new and they haven't been involved in the 20 plus years, they're still obligated if the courts decide that the prescriptive right has been maintained. The final case I want to talk about is Durbecker versus Lynch. And this is the idea of collected surface water. So again, we talked a little bit about when it's not collected, it's likely not the grounds for a lawsuit. But in this particular case, we have collected water. So the upper agricultural property owner had some tiles that they were collecting water in, and they directed it at the fence line onto the lower property owner. And it flowed naturally across the property. So you can see in the bottom left there that it's sort of a swale, if you will, along the edge of the road, and it ultimately went to the outlet of a natural water course or a municipal drain. So initially then this was going and it worked quite well for everybody. Durbecker, who's the upper property owner, had additional tile drainage work done, and then they outletted that again at the 20 feet from the property line. This increased flow caused erosion to occur on Lynch's property. And Lynch, being a good neighbor, decided, well, I can help address this. And so he did some ditching on his own property to alleviate the concern of the erosion. So basically, the lower property owner said, yeah, I want to be a good neighbor. I got some erosion, so I'm going to do something to make it so it doesn't erode my property, but I'm happy to take the water. When the lower property owner then went and said, actually, I'd like some dollars here to contribute to this because I had to get a backhoe on site. I had to bring in some material, riprap, et cetera, to do some erosion control. I would like you to help me pay for those costs. The upper property owner refused to contribute those costs. And so ultimately then the lower landowner, after doing some private ditching, as you can see on the bottom right picture, went back quite upset and basically filled in the ditch and the swale that was there and built a berm to block the flow of water and keep it on the upper property. So again, this resulted in a court challenge. And in this particular case, the court decision looked at and reviewed this idea of what is a natural water course. And we talked about that earlier. And so they determined that this was not the case. This is not a natural water course. This is surface water. They looked at the concept of the original drainage and they agreed, the court said it did have a prescriptive right. So had the lower property owner blocked it initially before additional property or water was brought in, then they would have had a prescriptive right. But because the upper property owner brought in additional water, that prescriptive right was lost. And then Durbecker, who was the upper property owner, was ordered to install a tile across Lynch's land because there was that erosion going on. The court actually said, well, it's important that we recognize that farming happens and we need an outlet, but we're not going to allow damage to occur to a downstream property. And so he was then ordered to install a tile across the other property. And then the downstream property owner was ordered to remove the blockage once that was installed. And the upper owner was ordered to pay damages for the work that was done ahead of time. So again, this is a pretty paramount case that looks at prescriptive rights, but only applicable if there's no change in the drainage scenario. And so again, it really comes down to a lot of these cases are, it's best if they can be resolved in a neighborly way, but again, know the rights, know the common law, and understand that the courts may be used to provide relief from that.